This is New York City, the most populous city in the United States of America. New York is a sprawling metropolis and one of the world's centers of finance and commerce, filled with vibrant streets and historic landmarks, and at the same time, one of the most unaffordable places to live in, with the average living expenses in the city reaching over $10,000 a month, a staggering cost all too familiar to those who live here. A big part of this unaffordability is found in the price of housing in New York. The median rent in Manhattan is currently over $4,700 a month, which adds up to $56,400 a year, a crazy sum, which is as much as the average income in the entirety of the United States, which is $59,000 a year. Rent in the adjacent Queens and Brooklyn is somewhat lower at a median of $3,900, which comes out to $46,800 a year, but still a great sum when compared to annual American income. Thus, it is no surprise that the government tried intervening many times to ease this shortage of apartments and thus lower the rent prices and make the city more affordable for its residents. The issue is, it hasn't worked out, like, at all, as we can see by today's rent prices. Rent control is one of those things that sounds plausible and entirely logical as measures of decreasing the cost of living. The policy even seems noble at its face, but for some reason, it just doesn't seem to work. Why is that? Well, it has to do with the basic principles of economics, that of supply and demand. Supply and demand have an opposite relationship with prices. If the supply of a certain good increases, then the price decreases. If the supply decreases, then the price increases. Inversely, if the demand for a good increases, then the price will also increase. And if the demand falls, the price will fall too. This principle is true for any good or service. This is why fuel in Dubai is extremely cheap, even though the cost of living is high. There is simply a very large supply of fuel in the area. And this is why fresh produce is unusually expensive in Hawaii, Bermuda, and other remote islands, because there is a low supply compared to the demand, since the importation costs are great. Similarly, in major cities, housing is usually expensive, not necessarily because of low supply, though that can play a factor too, but because of extremely high demand. How do rent controls change that? Fundamentally, they do not. Let's look at the United States as a whole after the Second World War. During the war, the government had enacted nationwide rent controls, and once the war had ended, there was a giant housing shortage. The shortage was so severe that people were bribing landlords to put them ahead on wait lists for apartments and buying abandoned trailers to live in because they couldn't get a hold of an apartment. Then, the rent controls were abolished, and very quickly, the shortage disappeared. On the surface, this doesn't seem logical, but it does make sense once we dig into the incentives that certain laws such as rent controls create. When rents are capped at a certain amount, or when they are prevented from increasing, the behaviors of both landlords and tenants change. Since rents are artificially lower than what the market would dictate, more people can afford them than they usually would be able to. Demand is increased, and since more people can afford to rent than there are units available to be rented, a shortage is created, and suddenly would-be tenants find themselves on waiting lists for apartments. There is a decrease in construction of new housing units since renting them out pays less than it otherwise would have, so investors prefer to invest their money elsewhere. People that otherwise wouldn't decide to rent an apartment, but now can because of artificially decreased prices, decide to rent. This includes teenagers or young adults that would otherwise live with their parents until their income increased more to the point where they can afford renting, or the elderly who would opt to rent smaller apartments since they no longer need the extra space and could use that extra savings. Additionally, many of those people who would otherwise decide to move in with roommates with rent controls in place decide to live alone due to artificially more affordable rent. All of these factors compound together to worsen or even create a housing shortage. This means that people such as families who could afford to pay a higher amount of rent in regular market conditions are now forced on waiting lists and left without housing. On the flip side, landlords who now find themselves with a much larger supply of customers find that they no longer need to maintain their properties as much as they used to, since if their current tenant decided to move out, they would immediately have access to a new one, courtesy of the aforementioned waiting lists. Over 50% of housing in New York is under some form of rent controls, which, even though they might have been well intentioned, have over time made the housing market even worse. On paper, rents are lower than they otherwise would be on day one if the rent controls were abolished. But in reality, many people cannot find apartments to rent in the shortage. Less housing is being built than it otherwise would have been, and existing housing isn't being maintained as well as it otherwise would have been without rent controls. There have been plenty of cases of New York buildings being burned down by their landlords since the insurance money they would receive would be far more than what they could get by renting out the units to tenants, which is sort of a loophole that would not exist under natural market conditions. There is another weird side effect that causes housing shortages under rent controls to persist almost permanently. Under free market conditions, when there is a higher demand for apartments and housing and the price of rent increases, so does construction of new housing units. Since renting is now more profitable than it used to be, new investors pour money into housing and development projects, and so put more units on the market, i.e., increase the supply again, which decreases the prices of real estate and the price of rent through the laws of supply and demand. This happens until the market balances itself out once more, and the rate of profit of renting is now more in line with the rate of profit of other industries. In simple terms, when there is more people moving to a city, increasing the demand for housing, landlords earn more money. Landlords, investors, and construction companies alike build more housing to get in on the new renting and real estate boom, which increases the amount of units available for rent. This new competition forces the prices back down until they reach an equilibrium. With rent controls in place, however, the profit that existing landlords would enjoy under free market conditions resulting from the housing shortage is outlawed, which means there's no rush to build new housing, which means the shortage never gets alleviated. Inadvertently, even though rent control policies might have been passed with the best intentions of easing the burden on the regular Joe, in many ways it has the opposite effect, only really being beneficial to those who get lucky and manage to find one of the apartments in short supply, and detrimental to others. Long term, rent controls result in an even larger housing shortage. Even though the track record of these laws is horrible, politicians are still very likely to benefit from proposing and passing such legislation because much of the voter base doesn't realize the long-term effects of such policies, even to their own detriment. And that is why, even though they don't work, we are likely to keep seeing rent control laws throughout the world, at least until we enhance our understanding of economic incentives and the laws of supply and demand. If you learned something new from this video, make sure to subscribe and let me know your thoughts down below. Do you agree with me? Or do you perhaps offer a defense of rent controls? I would love to hear from you, and maybe we can even argue in the comments.